There's an old movie with a song that says, "Love means never having to say you're sorry." And when you think about it, that's true. So if love means never having to say you're sorry, what causes people in love to hurt the ones they love? Why do victims stay in an abusive situation? Domestic violence is more prevalent than you may think. What reforms must exist to shift thinking, attitudes, and most importantly, behaviors? Grab your pen and paper. Take a note on what love does not look like.
Hey, you.
Yeah, you. Getting that college education?
What are you gonna do? Graduate and take some office job?
Be like everybody else?
Or will you dare do something different?
Like, be a teacher. You could be my teacher.
You got the skills.
The smarts?
Yes, you.
You could be the teacher I never forget.
That'd be cool.
Does that corporate job even have recess?
What are you gonna make of yourself?
What are you gonna make of me?
Hello and welcome to the Clarion Call Show. I'm Janice Liggins, your host. So, is real love also abusive? Does real love cause physical or emotional hurt? Joining us today to share insights into the complexities and challenges of domestic violence are Ms. Sophie Ford, Executive Director of the Family Crisis Center of Prince George's County. And we have Mr. Ron LeGrand, President and CEO of the LeGrand Group, a public policy consultancy. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you both with us, particularly as it relates to the topic of domestic violence. And I will be the first to say that I've not paid much attention to the topic and subject of domestic violence. Shame on me. I think, unfortunately, I'm part of the norm. And so I'm glad to be able to shed some light on this subject. So before we get started and delve too deep, though, we talked a little bit about the name of your organization and yours. So, but just very briefly, tell us, what does the Family Crisis Center do?
Sure. So the Family Crisis Center was established in 1981, so we're celebrating 35 years of service this year. We were established initially as the only domestic violence shelter in Prince George's County, and we remain that today.
Wow.
But throughout the years, we've expanded our services to offer other levels of care that include outpatient counseling and victim support groups, as well as abuser intervention services. Right now, we operate in multiple locations, including Upper Marlboro at the Family Justice Center, Langley Park, where we do services in Spanish, and at our undisclosed shelter location in our administrative offices in Brentwood, Maryland.
Wonderful. And I know, Mr. LeGrand, you have done public policy supports and programs behind domestic violence for years, on Capitol Hill even. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the LeGrand Group is a newly formed entity. It really taps into the work that I've done on Capitol Hill, as well as the work that I've done in the advocacy arena. Consulting with domestic violence coalitions, with other advocacy organizations, with an emphasis on prevention and engaging men and boys, and doing something that goes along with treatment of victims, providing services to victims. But in addition to providing those services to victims, we've got to have more prevention.
Right.
We've got to invest more resources on prevention.
And we're going to get in a lot more detail on that end a little bit later on. And I know you're focused, Sophie, on ending the cycle of abuse, because it does tend to be a cycle. And when you typically think of domestic violence, for me, I think of the image of a husband beating his wife.
Sure.
But it's not necessarily a husband-wife scenario.
Right.
Is that the case? So give us an idea of what do you see?
Sure. So the first thing I'd like to say is that it could be a wife beating her husband.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, and then beyond that, in terms of the types of abuse, beyond physical, because you're right, a lot of people, when they think of this issue, they think of it in the extreme situations where someone has been physically harmed or even worse, killed. But there's also financial abuse that happens, sexual abuse, psychological and emotional abuse that happens. And so we see it across all of those spectrums at Family Crisis Center in terms of gender and types of abuse.
And
in addition to that, we also need to think in terms of verbal abuse, where you see one partner verbally putting down the other. And sometimes it may be one-on-one, sometimes it may be in the presence of others, even in the presence of children. You've also got to understand that when we talk about the intimate partner, it crosses that whole segment. So it could be bisexual, heterosexual, homosexual, transgender. So
relationship. Any type of a
relationship.
relationship.
It's intimate partners,
Right.
however they define themselves.
Wow. Wow. What is the likelihood of a woman, we'll say women for example, to be a victim of domestic violence? Do you know, I mean, typically, how prevalent is it?
It's very prevalent. Statistically speaking, 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will experience that. And so it's something that is extremely common but also underreported. But we know that that is something that happens not just here locally but across the world. The numbers are really staggering for women.
And does it necessarily apply just to, is it rich people, poor people,
It's
famous
an equal
people?
opportunity. It's an equal opportunity form of abuse.
Absolutely.
And think in terms of 3 women are murdered every day in conflict with their intimate partner. Or 3 women are being abused. 1 woman is being abused every 9 seconds. All right, so when you want to talk about the prevalence, that's...
My goodness.
Yeah.
Is there a particular group that's any more prevalent, that this shows up for, any more prevalent? Is there any particular group?
Well, women of color definitely experience abuse at rates that are higher than other populations.
Why do you think
And
that is?
You know what? I don't have an easy answer or a straightforward answer for that. I really don't. I wish I could figure that out. But I don't. I know at Family Crisis Center, we predominantly see women of color, and that's also reflective of the demographics of the county. But we certainly have seen others too, but we know just in terms of just even national statistics and even across the world, women of color definitely are affected at higher rates.
Janice, there's also, as we look at the demographics, in working on the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, one of the things that we learned is that tribal women are abused in far greater numbers than just about any other demographic group. And a lot of that was because prior to the Violence Against Women Act of 2013 being signed into law, tribal authorities had no jurisdiction over a non-tribal man who physically abused, raped, abused in any way a tribal woman on tribal lands. And so the numbers were going up because those non-tribal men saw this as an opportunity to do whatever they wanted to do without being held accountable. As bad as those numbers are, the numbers are even worse for Alaskan Native women.
Well, there's a lot more reform that needs to take place, obviously.
A lot more.
And you mentioned that men can be victims too. How often do you see that, and what does it do to the psyche of the man? It's traumatic for the woman,
Sure.
but it has to be, I would imagine, even more traumatic for the man. What do you think?
Well, we have seen men at our program. And so in our victim services, we've seen men who are in same-sex relationships as well as heterosexual relationships that come through our door seeking help. And you're right, they are just as traumatized as women are, right? But the other thing that men have to grapple with are all of the societal labels and myths that men should be and what they should do in relationships. And so it's really a struggle for them to get. So I'm always super pleased when I see one coming in, because they've reached that point where they finally now will walk through those doors. And so we want to make sure that we engage them the same way we would a woman when they come in, so that they know they're welcome.
What about younger people, the younger age group, say 20 to 35? Do you see any difference? What's the general age of the abuser? Is there an age? I mean, are older people more prone to it than, or mid 40, 50, or is there a focus area?
It varies.
So it can strike any culture or any age.
Statistics say that women ages 18 to 24 perhaps are most vulnerable to abuse by an intimate partner. Another demographic that is exposed are seniors, okay? Or those who have disabilities, and the more severe the disability is, the greater the likelihood of the severity of abuse.
That's a very interesting part, because I had not looked at that, and you've heard of senior citizens or disabled people being abused, but I hadn't put the two together to connect that to domestic violence, but it is.
Absolutely.
My goodness.
It is.
Absolutely.
My goodness.
And I think we also need to be clear that we've talked in terms of intimate partner violence, but it can also be familial, all right? So that it is a member of the family who is perpetrating the abuse. It could be parent-child, it could be child-older parent.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so the definition of this issue needs to be expanded and understood.
So if love means never having to say you're sorry, why is it that someone would feel the need to or be prone to taking their aggression out on the person they love?
Patriarchy goes back generations. All right, the notion of the man as the dominant entity, the man being in control, the man being the decision maker, the controller of everything. And from that, the notion that the wife is subservient, is to be obedient. And anytime the man feels that authority or dominance is being challenged, then he reacts, he responds.
And so why would the woman stay, or the victim, I'll say, stay in a relationship? What traits, what tends to make them stay?
Well, for a lot of people, I like to always kind of couch it like this, right? So we know that they're victims, and that's what we commonly identify people as. Right. But also realize that there are other labels involved with that person, right? So they might be a mom, they might be an executive, they may be a first lady of a church. There's so many other things that happen in people, and it's a reality.
It is a reality.
So for many victims in that space, I'm having to negotiate all of those roles and what that means and how I'll exit, and if I'll exit, and if I'll stay, and what that looks like. And so that is very challenging for a lot of people to actually grapple with. And then the other thing about it, if we are talking about intimate partner relationships, that is usually viewed as intimate, so it's usually viewed as a very private matter. So a lot of people treat it as a private matter, and I think even as a society, that's also why it's also kind of shunned, because people do view it, and even though he just kind of expanded it to include just domestic abuse in terms of other relationships, but when we talk about intimate partner violence, people really want to stay private with that.
The pressures to stay can be enormous. I mean, the mention of the first lady of a church, and I have a friend who was in that situation. All right, she was the first lady of her church, and was being abused regularly.
My goodness, my goodness, my goodness. We're going to come right back to that. So how do we get to the point of love means never having to say you're sorry? What role can prevention play? That's next. Stay with us.
It's 3 p.m. For 50 million kids across America, school's out. And for a third of these kids, they're out on their own. Out with nowhere to go. Out with nothing to do. Out all afternoon when anything can happen. But every afternoon is a chance to change America's future. All you have to do is open the door. It's time to support the Boys and Girls Clubs. Great futures start here.
Welcome back. We all know that love can break your heart. But if love physically hurts, something's wrong. If love emotionally hurts, something is wrong. What reforms must exist to shift thinking from attitudes and behaviors? With us again is Sophie Ford and Ron LeGrand. So, if we're going to start off looking at reforms and prevention, what considerations must be given to the abuser? If we're going to look at prevention, certainly the abuser has to be factored in. So I know that's one of your areas of specialty, Ron. So how do we treat the abuser?
You have to sit down and talk to the abuser, all right? The last thing you want to do is shut them out, ostracize them, or reject them. You want to hold them accountable, all right? And it requires some serious conversation to have him or her look at the behavior, the offensive behavior, and work through the rationale, the thinking behind that behavior. Sometimes you'll find that the abuser comes from an abusive home life. Statistics say that boys who grow up in abusive homes are 4 times more likely to be abusers themselves. And it seems that the opposite should be true, that where girls witness the mother being abused, it may become their idea of what a normal, healthy relationship looks like. So you've got to work on both. On the abuser, you definitely have to talk to them. But I'm also advocating that we talk to and we engage with boys and young men early on. The earlier you see them, the earlier you get them, the better the chance of influencing, or what I call rewiring, attitudes and behaviors.
So,
think of it this way, you know, and I'm a member of the 100 Black Men, and their slogan is, "What they see is what they'll be." That's very true. That's very true. Yeah.
So in working with the boys, starting at earlier ages, would you suggest starting with those who come from a family where they've experienced abuse, or just young boys? Everybody.
Because you don't know what their
Every
background
boy.
is, where they're coming from. So it's
good.
important, and it's important. There are programs that deal with boys who are involved in athletic programs. So it's training coaches to coach boys into manhood, and that's great. But not every boy is involved in organized sports, and so we've got to do something that captures all of the boys, regardless of their extracurricular activities.
And I know, Sophie, you work with the female as well as the male. And have you ever worked with the abuser and the victim in out of the same household or family?
We have. We have.
How do you balance the service and support to the abuser when you're working with both the abuser and the victim?
It's really on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it's best to refer one of them out, honestly. But we have had those cases where they want to come together. They're at a point where they can come together. Just because they want to doesn't mean always it's the best idea, but they can come at that place and come together and work through some things, because we do have a certified abuse and intervention program at our agency. So we're one of 3 in the county that provides that service.
Wonderful. So what would it take to get the victim to recognize that it's okay and that they should speak up and speak out and not suffer in silence?
I think
How do
things
you
like
do that?
this.
Okay.
Honestly, I think the more we normalize that it's okay,
Okay.
the easier it becomes. The biggest thing, or one of the biggest things that keeps people operating in silence, is the fear of being shamed,
Right.
the guilt that they may feel. Remember, I talked about all of those labels. So now what will my kids think of dad or mom or all those other things, and in-laws, and just all of those other connectors to us.
Right.
And so helping people know that we want to look at you as an individual and what you need and what's okay for you first and foremost is very important. And having a welcoming space for people to be able to enter through to do that is key. So I think platforms like this, talking about it, just like now we've learned to do with mental illness,
Yes.
HIV, so many other issues that were taboo, we need to put this on the table in that same way.
Very good.
This program is going to be very informative, and we want to let people know who might be in that situation that there's help.
Absolutely.
You know, that's the thing that's going to be the biggest game changer for people to understand that there is help out there, that if you're in an abusive situation, maybe you can go to your pastor. There's certainly the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And there are a number of hotlines that are available, and they're well trained. They can help you talk through the situation, and if it's about developing an exit plan, so that you don't leave right now, but you plan your exit. There are codes that can be used so that if the abuser happens to come in when you're on the phone or you're on the website, there are buttons that you can push on your keyboard to just clear that screen.
Okay.
There are ways of ending the phone call in a way that the abuser doesn't know what you've been doing.
Very good. Very good. And when it gets to that point, I imagine the victim is pretty much caught in a trap. And we're talking about love, and love means never having to say you're sorry. But there are some victims who consider the abuse a part of that person showing love.
Right. Absolutely.
And so how do you work with that person? How do you convince them that love does not physically hurt?
Or other ways, right? So I think for us, one of the biggest things we do at Family Crisis Center is first respect that that's where you are. One of the biggest things that we need to do is, because that goes back to the guilt and the shame. Oh, you're saying I was wrong. How dumb I must be to have stayed in that situation, right? So if you come in and say to me, that is what's been going on for a year or 20 years, I'll accept that that's where you are, and then we'll work from there. And we'll work through some of the things he talked about. If maybe you witnessed that as a child, or what happened. And then, so it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you to get you to this place. And that's how we want to kind of start that conversation.
It's important also to not appear to be judgmental. All right, to not be saying to that person who's coming in that you're wrong to be staying there. And this is also important for friends who may be in a position to recognize that a friend of theirs is in an abusive situation. Sometimes it's the friend who recognizes it before the actual victim. And it may be that it may not have escalated to physical abuse, but there's an escalation that occurs where friends may see the power and control that is taking place on a gradual basis.
Are there signs that the abuser, are there signs generally to look for in a person who is prone to be an abuser? You know, for example, even if you're entering a relationship, sometimes we can be very open and accepting of a lot of things when we're entering a relationship. But are there signs? Even if you're already in a relationship, are there signs that you could look for that are typical for an abuser?
Sure, there definitely are. Even early on, looking for things like some stalking tendencies, or maybe in the beginning when you met the person, you were out socially with a group of friends, and you look up and now you guys are exclusive, and it's a huge problem for you now to go out. And not only is it a problem, but what do you have on? Why do you have that makeup on? those types of questions, again, trying to isolate, trying to exert a certain level of control over what you do, whom you do it with, how you do it, why you, all of those types of things, you start to really take pause for those types of behaviors and questions, and how those questions come out, and depending on what your response is, how they react to that response.
And so are there certain traits for the victim that signal the abuser that this person is capable of being a victim? I can have the upper hand with this person. Are there certain things that the victim signals to the abuser? Not that it's okay, but just does the abuser typically look for people of a certain trait?
Sometimes an eagerness or willingness to please, perhaps to an extreme, where the potential abuser recognizes that this person is agreeing to everything that I say, and it's obvious that he or she really wants my approval.
Wow.
Okay, and so that person's eagerness to get along, to please, to satisfy the other individual before the abuse even begins is sometimes a setup for an unintentional setup.
Someone just being kind,
That's
friendly, or whatever could be
mistaking the kindness for
weakness.
Weakness.
We've heard
That's
that
right.
before.
Yeah.
We've heard that before. So when you're talking about prevention and measures to try to reduce all of the data that we've seen, what's one of the first things that intervene? The prevention, I would imagine, has to take form in the abuser situation as well as the victim situation. So what would you say would be the key thing to focus on in each group?
So we were talking earlier about trauma and how there's so many people who have been traumatized, but they haven't dealt with that trauma. So a lot of times the behavior that we're seeing are byproducts of that unprocessed or undealt with trauma. So I definitely think that when you have people who are walking around and trying to connect with other people in a really intimate way, when they have a lot of unresolved issues, that can be a really big recipe for disaster.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And trauma can exist in both the victim and the abuser.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, this is you've been around 35 years, the organization, 35 years. Your anniversary's coming up.
It is. We're celebrating October 21st at Camelot Von Martins. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
So we're so excited for
Wonderful.
that, and we are looking forward to having a great evening and celebrating all of the years of service that we've had to Prince George's County community.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we appreciate both of you being on the show.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank
And
you.
hopefully this has been a blessing to somebody who is viewing and listening.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much for having
Thank
us.
you. Domestic violence is never, ever, ever the right course of action. And if you're in a situation where you are experiencing or even witnessing domestic violence, speak up and speak out. Call the Family Crisis Center of Prince George's County for help and a safe place retreat. Remember, nothing you do justifies anyone to take their aggression out on you. You deserve better. That's it for now, and we hope you enjoyed the show. Join us next time, won't you, for the Clarion Call. Until then, I'm Janice Liggins. Blessings to you.